$9 billion gone. When I saw that number flash across my screen at 3:47 a.m., I knew this wasn't just another bureaucratic nightmare. This was the smoking gun we'd been hunting for months. What happened next would shake Minnesota to its core, expose the deepest corruption in state history, and somehow, I'd be called a racist for following the money. You need to understand something about me first. I've spent my entire career following paper trails that others were too scared to touch. From the Pentagon to the Justice Department, I've seen how power really works in America. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I discovered buried in Minnesota's Child Nutrition Program files. The documents were spread across my desk at 2 a.m. Bank statements, wire transfers, fake invoices. Each page told the same story. Systematic theft disguised as helping children. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I couldn't stop reading. Every number was wrong. Every claim was fabricated. The call came from a source inside the Minnesota Department of Education. Their voice was shaking. Cash, they're stealing everything here. Picture this. It's January 2024, and Tim Walz is riding high as governor. The media loves him, progressive hero. But behind the scenes, something was rotting. And that something had a name, feeding our future. Here's where it gets personal. I grew up poor. I know what it feels like to wonder where your next meal is coming from. So when someone steals money meant to feed hungry kids, that cuts deep. But this wasn't just theft. This was systematic, calculated, and it happened right under Walz's nose while he was too busy playing progressive politics to notice his own house was burning down. The scope was breathtaking. Fake nonprofits with names like Feeding Dreams Foundation and Children's Hope Alliance, designed to sound legitimate, trustworthy, but dig deeper and you'd find they were all connected. Same addresses, same bank accounts, same mastermind pulling the strings. The first clue came in the form of a restaurant in Minneapolis, Brava Restaurant and Cafe. On paper, they were serving 4,000 meals a day to children. 4,000. Every single day. But here's the thing. I drove by that place myself. You know what I saw? Empty tables. Closed half the time. Maybe space for 50 people max. I sat in my car across the street for 3 hours watching. During peak meal service, maybe 12 people walked in. 12. But according to their claims, they were feeding hundreds every hour. That's when I knew we weren't dealing with simple incompetence. Someone was running a con, and it was brilliant in its audacity. I started digging deeper. Document after document, bank transfer after bank transfer, and the pattern became crystal clear. Fake nonprofit organizations claiming to feed children. Phantom meal sites that existed only on paper. Shell companies laundering money faster than I could track it. But here's what really got to me. While this massive fraud was unfolding, where was Governor Walz? He was on TV talking about equity. He was giving speeches about fighting for children. Meanwhile, the very programs he was championing were being gutted by criminals. The Department of Education knew. They had to know. Red flags were everywhere. Organizations claiming impossible meal numbers. Sites that couldn't be verified. Payments going to businesses that didn't exist. But they kept writing checks. I remember the moment I called my contact at the FBI. I said, "We need to move on this now." Because every day we waited, more money disappeared. More children went hungry while criminals got rich. The silence on the other end lasted forever. Finally, my contact said, "Cash, this isn't just fraud. This is organized crime dressed up as charity work." That's when I knew we weren't dealing with a few bad actors. This was a network operating freely while Walz's team looked the other way. Then came the bombshell. October 2022. Federal agents arrested 47 people in the largest pandemic fraud case in the nation. 47 people, all connected to a network that stole money meant for hungry children in Minnesota. And the total? $250 million. That's what they could prove. But my sources were telling me the real number was much, much higher. Some estimates put it at over $9 billion when you factor in all the connected schemes. Now here's where Governor Walz made his biggest mistake. Instead of taking responsibility, instead of admitting his administration failed to protect these programs, he went on the attack. He blamed federal oversight. He blamed the Trump administration's policies. He blamed everyone except the people who actually let this happen. His own team. I watched him on television, and I felt sick. Here was a man who had allowed the largest child nutrition fraud in American history to happen on his watch, and he was pointing fingers instead of fixing the problem. Fast forward to 2025. President Trump is back in office. And one of the first briefings he gets is about Minnesota's disaster. The federal funding that flows to states for child nutrition programs. The complete breakdown of oversight under Walz. The billions in losses that taxpayers had to cover. I was in the Oval Office when the decision was made. Trump looked at the file, looked at me and said, "How do we make sure this never happens again?" The silence in the room was heavy. Chief of Staff, Treasury Secretary, couple other advisors were there. Trump flipped through the pages, stopped at a photo of one fake meal site, an empty warehouse claiming to feed thousands. He looked up. $9 billion cash? That's not a mistake. That's a crime scene. The answer was simple but painful. Federal oversight, real accountability, and yes, freezing additional funding until Minnesota could prove they had their house in order. Within hours of the announcement, the attacks began. Walz held a press conference. Instead of addressing the fraud, instead of explaining how his administration had failed, he played the race card. He called the funding freeze racist. He said it was targeting communities of color. I watched from my office, shaking my head in disbelief. Here was a man deflecting from his own incompetence by weaponizing identity politics. I sat there watching this unfold, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This man had allowed criminals to steal money meant for hungry children, many of them children of color, and when held accountable, he was crying racism. But that's the playbook, isn't it? When you can't defend your record, when you can't explain your failures, you attack the messenger. You make it about race instead of about accountability. The truth is, this had nothing to do with race and everything to do with competence. It didn't matter if the fraudsters were black, white, Hispanic, or purple. They stole money from children. Period. What really bothered me were the real victims getting lost in this political theater. The legitimate organizations that actually fed children and now couldn't get funding because of increased scrutiny. The families who lost services because of criminal networks that Walz's administration failed to catch. I started receiving calls from community leaders in Minneapolis. Real people doing real work. They were frustrated. They understood why federal oversight had to increase. They blamed Walz for creating this mess, not Trump for trying to fix it. One call stands out. A woman named Sarah who ran an after-school program in North Minneapolis. She told me, "Mr. Patel, we've been trying to get the state's attention about these fake organizations for years. Nobody listened. Now we can't get funding because of the crackdown, and kids are suffering." Her voice broke. I personally called the department 6 times about a supposed food site 2 blocks from me. They claimed 800 meals a day, but the building was abandoned. Boarded up, no electricity. 6 times I called. Nothing happened until the FBI showed up. That's when I realized the full scope of what Walz had done. He hadn't just allowed fraud. He had ignored the warnings from legitimate organizations who were trying to blow the whistle. The documents I obtained through FOIA requests painted a devastating picture. Email after email from real nonprofits raising red flags about suspicious operations, site visits that were never conducted, audits that were pencil-whipped, a complete breakdown of the most basic oversight functions. And through it all, Walz's team was more concerned about looking progressive than being competent. They fast-tracked applications without vetting. They ignored suspicious data. They prioritized speed over security. But here's what really made my blood boil. While children went hungry because legitimate programs couldn't get funding due to the increased scrutiny, some of the people who stole money were living in luxury, million-dollar homes, luxury cars, vacations to Dubai. They took money meant for hungry children and bought themselves mansions. The criminal cases wrapped up throughout 2024. Guilty plea after guilty plea. Prison sentence after prison sentence. Each conviction validated what we knew. This was massive, systematic fraud that could have been prevented with basic oversight. One defendant alone admitted to stealing $40 million. Another bought a $1.4 million house with stolen funds. They weren't even trying to hide it. Meanwhile, Walz was gearing up for a political future. He wanted to move beyond Minnesota. But the fraud scandal wasn't going away. Every time his name came up for higher office, the questions followed. How did this happen on your watch? Why didn't you catch it sooner? What changes have you made? His answers were always the same. Deflection, blame, playing the victim instead of taking responsibility. When Trump announced the funding freeze, I knew exactly what would happen. The progressive media would line up behind Walz. They'd ignore the fraud and focus on the response. They'd make it about politics instead of about protecting taxpayer dollars. And that's exactly what happened. Story after story about how the funding freeze was punitive or racist. Very few stories about how billions of dollars meant for children had been stolen under Walz's watch. But the people of Minnesota deserve better. They deserved a governor who would protect their tax dollars. They deserved leaders who would put children before politics. They deserved accountability. The funding freeze wasn't punishment. It was protection. Protection for future programs, legitimate organizations, and the children these programs serve. As I write this, The federal investigation is ongoing. More arrests are coming, more convictions are likely, and every single case proves the same thing. Minnesota under Walz failed to protect the most vulnerable people in society. The real tragedy isn't the politics. It's not the finger-pointing or the name-calling. The real tragedy is that while criminals were stealing billions, children were going hungry. Real children, in real communities, with real needs. And when leaders like Walz prioritize politics over competence, everyone suffers. The children who don't get fed, the taxpayers who foot the bill for fraud, the legitimate organizations that get caught in the crossfire. This is why elections matter. This is why oversight matters. This is why accountability matters. Because when government fails, real people pay the price. The phone call that started this investigation changed everything for me. It reminded me why I do this work. It's not about politics. It's not about party affiliation. It's about protecting the people who can't protect themselves. And sometimes that means making hard decisions, even when those decisions get you called names, even when the media attacks you, even when politicians try to make it about race instead of about right and wrong. $9 billion, gone. But the truth remains. And eventually the truth always comes out.